It feels like every day there's just this flood of news, and trying to figure out what's really going on beneath the surface, well, it can be overwhelming.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost.
Exactly. So our goal here is to help you quickly make sense of it all. We're going to dive into some pretty detailed perspectives we've gathered on the big shifts happening right now.
We've looked at a lot of analysis trying to piece together the bigger picture.
We want to unpack what's happening in Eastern Europe, the Middle East.
Yeah.
Connect some dots you might not see in the day-to-day headlines. By the end, hopefully, you'll have a much clearer, sort of well-informed view.
Yeah, think of it as putting the puzzle pieces together, moving beyond just the immediate events to see the broader strategic currents.
Okay, let's jump in. Eastern Europe first. Recent reports we've seen mention some pretty intense actions, missile strikes into Donetsk, for example.
Yes, and specifically mentioning Storm Shadow missiles, apparently. The reports suggest civilian casualties resulted from those strikes.
It sounds grim. Some observers are even calling it a kind of revenge weapon situation.
That's the term being used, yeah. And strategically, it's quite significant. Our sources suggest areas like Luhansk and Donetsk have been, well, systematically cleaned out of opposing forces. That's a major ground shift.
Cleaned out. And there's more movement, too, towards Kyiv.
Reports point to specific units. One mentioned is a predominantly Chechen battalion, but importantly reinforced with advanced drone operators, and they're heading towards Kyiv.
And there was something about a list.
Yeah, the material suggests they might actually have a list of specific people they're targeting.
Wow. And these targets, they're the Azov battalion members, the ones sometimes called head choppers.
That's what the sources indicate, yes. Given that reputation, the accounts describe some pretty definitive actions being taken against them.
Okay, so zooming out, what does this movement suggest about the bigger Russian strategy? Is this like a final phase?
Well, that's the interpretation in some of this analysis. A potential final phase that could, theoretically, involve crossing the river, going into Kyiv itself, and then pushing south towards Odessa.
That's ambitious. And the timing, does it connect to anything else happening politically?
It's interesting. Yeah, the suggestion is that this timing might align with shifts outside the region. Specifically, reports hinting at a U.S. president wanting to, let's say, normalize things with Moscow to then pivot focus more towards the Middle East.
Okay, so if this is a final push, what about pressure inside Russia? Is the leadership feeling pushed to just get it done? Is there a public desire for a quick end, like a sledgehammer to Kyiv scenario?
Well, the sources suggest it's more nuanced.
Yeah.
Yes, the population almost certainly wants it over quickly. Who wouldn't? But the leadership, particularly Putin, has apparently moved very cautiously, very deliberately throughout this.
So not rushing.
Seems not. The analysis suggests a calculated approach, primarily aimed at avoiding any direct clash with the U.S. or NATO. The view seems to be that a wider war is just, well, utter futility and stupidity is the phrase used.
Yeah.
So despite that internal pressure you mentioned, the strategy seems to remain methodical. The expectation, though, based on these sources, a really profound change on the map by, say, the end of September.
A changed map by autumn and changes in Europe, too.
Yeah. Alongside that, an anticipation of big shifts in European governments. France and Germany are mentioned specifically.
Meanwhile, weapons are still flowing from the U.S., right? Though maybe slower.
The sources note that, yes,
Yeah.
continued arms supply, but also efforts maybe to dampen it somewhat. But it's clear there's still, deep animosity towards Russia in parts of the U.S. political system.
And that reported goal?
Yeah.
To overthrow the government, divide it up, fragment it, strip it of resources.
That strategy, yes. The sources argue it didn't work against Russia, and now that same playbook, or a similar one, is seemingly being turned towards Iran.
Which brings us neatly to the Middle East. You mentioned the pivot. What are the sources saying about recent events there, like the Iranian missile strikes?
Quite a lot, actually. Analyses mentioned by name, Ted Postel, Larry Johnson. They reportedly detail enormous damage from those Iranian missiles. Johnson's map is highlighted as showing just how extensive it was.
Showcasing their tech.
Exactly. Showcasing Iran's technology and precision.
Yeah.
It seems to have surprised quite a few people.
And the ceasefire that followed, how did that come about? It wasn't straightforward, was it?
No, the reports are quite surprising. They suggest one side actually appealed to the U.S. president for help because they were getting, quote, pulverized. They were running out of anti-missiles fast.
Running out? How?
Well, apparently they needed to fire at least 2 interceptors at each incoming Iranian missile just to have a decent chance of hitting it. You can see how quickly you'd burn through your stockpile that way.
Wow, yeah, so they initiated the ceasefire.
The implication is yes. The sources suggest the Iranian side was actually prepared for the long haul. So the call for a stop seems to have come from the side taking the hits.
And there were admissions about underestimating Iran?
Publicly, yes, according to these accounts. A prominent political figure reportedly admitted they underestimated or didn't appreciate the quality of the Iranian arsenal. That's quite a statement.
And the economy was feeling it too.
Acutely. A finance minister apparently warned they had maybe another week, maybe 2 weeks before it imploded. Just couldn't sustain the pressure.
So damage, dwindling defenses, economic strain, which leads to the question of rebuilding. Who pays?
The analysis points squarely at the United States bearing the lion's share of that cost.
Yeah.
Billions, potentially trillions.
And specific companies benefiting.
It's noted that contractors linked to certain big investment houses in New York City are reportedly well-positioned to handle that rebuilding effort.
So the U.S. steps in, pays for rebuilding, becomes, as one source put it, a co-belligerent, supporting one side so actively.
That's the term used, yeah. Not technically fighting, but deeply involved in supporting one side. And the assessment is that this has sort of opened Pandora's box.
How so? What's the long-term impact?
Well, perception is key here. One major regional player, Israel, is now viewed by many, including, critically, Moscow and Beijing, as essentially an instrument of the U.S. Their power projection seen as reliant on American backing.
And that changes things.
Profoundly. And despite the ceasefire, the sources are very clear. This conflict is not over. It's just paused. The underlying dynamics are still very much in play.
Which connects to this whole web of regional influences and maybe hidden agendas. Let's talk Caucasus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia.
Right, another complex flashpoint. Historical tensions, land disputes. But the sources highlight Azerbaijan's specific strategic role,
Which is?
reportedly providing a base of operations for Israel intelligence, defense forces to launch actions into Iran, apparently quite openly.
Openly hostile to Iran.
A real contempt for Iran is mentioned. But crucially, they also apparently signaled contempt for Moscow, which was seen as a mistake.
Why a mistake?
Because Iran, despite tensions, is strategically vital for Russia's stability across Eurasia. Moscow does not want Iran to break into pieces or have a hostile government take over there. It disrupts their whole southern flank.
So this connects to that bigger idea you mentioned, the push by some outside powers to see Iran fragmented.
Exactly. The sources lay out this controversial argument that certain financial interests, London, New York, working with Israel, see Iran as the last holdout of defiance against their hegemony. They want control of the resources, and Iran stands in the way.
And they're using strategies similar to Eastern Europe.
That's the claim. Using other proxies in the region to achieve that goal of breaking Iran apart.
Does Syria fit into this picture?
It does, according to this analysis. Turkey's leader, Erdogan, is seen as currently focused on crushing any potential Kurdish state. But once that's done, the sources suggest he'd have no issue with Syria being used as a launch pad for attacks against Shiites in Iraq.
Why Iraq?
Because, in this view, Iraq is considered part of Greater Iran in terms of influence. So attacking Shiites there is seen as indirectly striking Iran. It shows how the conflict could spread.
Okay, let's shift to Egypt. Often overlooked, but huge. The largest Arab state.
And with ties now, interestingly, to both Saudi Arabia and Iran, the sources highlight a really significant moment. The Saudi crown prince apparently expressing direct sympathy and support to Iranian leaders.
Linking Riyadh, Tehran, and Cairo.
Creating that critical linkage, yes, which makes Egypt's position even more complex.
How so? What's happening internally there?
The sources describe a seething cauldron of discontent. Huge frustration over the government's inaction on Gaza, despite massive popular pressure and large numbers of troops sitting right near the border.
So why the inaction?
Money, basically. The analysis points to substantial financial subsidies from the U.S. The Egyptian government is seen as unwilling to risk losing that aid by taking a stronger stance.
Which feeds into this whole Greater Israel Project concept mentioned in the sources.
Yes, an idea that many in the West reportedly are not taking seriously, but which adherents believe includes territory from the Suez to the Euphrates.
A vast area.
Huge. And the critical assertion in these sources is that the U.S. is now seen as part and parcel of it, actively supporting this vision, whether implicitly or explicitly.
This is getting into some really deep and frankly unsettling territory regarding U.S. policy.
It does raise serious questions. The sources detail deep involvement from U.S. intelligence, CIA, Langley in the region, specifically subverting and attacking enemies of the United States and Israel.
Even if they aren't really enemies.
That's the implication, that the definition of enemy might be heavily influenced by Israeli interests. And a key point highlighted is the power of U.S. Central Command, CNACM.
The military command for the region.
Right. It's reportedly become incredibly powerful, providing intelligence sometimes directly to the White House, potentially bypassing other channels.
And the CNTCOM commander, General Kurilla, the sources suggest he's closer to Netanyahu than Biden.
That's the reported perception, yes.
Yeah.
That he's very gung-ho about using U.S. military might to achieve Israeli objectives. There are even reports mentioned of joint U.S.-Israeli planning for potential military action.
And the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his background.
General Brown. The sources suggest he was appointed partly because he was seen as a tough guy who wouldn't have reservations about embroiling U.S. air and naval power, or even ground forces, to support Israel's aims. His previous board position at a hedge fund is also noted.
It paints a picture of military leadership potentially very aligned with expanding another country's influence using U.S. power.
That's the disturbing picture presented in the analysis, yes.
Which leads to maybe the most alarming point. Talk of using low-yield nuclear weapons.
Yeah, this is discussed as a real, ongoing conversation within some military circles, according to these sources. There was a push years ago to fund these weapons, build them.
But how would anyone know it's low yield? Wouldn't it just look like a nuclear attack?
That was exactly the criticism. The answer back then, reportedly, was basically, well, we think they'll figure that out. Not exactly reassuring. But the point is, these weapons exist now. The temptation might be there.
And there was that senator's recent briefing, Kennedy.
Senator John Kennedy, yes. He described being told that Iran was within days of having a nuclear weapon. But the crucial part was his admission. He didn't know if that assessment came from Israeli intelligence or U.S. intelligence.
And why does that distinction matter so much?
Because the source is everything, especially if it's foreign intelligence driving U.S. policy decisions. The sources draw a historical parallel here, referencing old papers suggesting Secretary of War Stimson actually welcomed Pearl Harbor to get the U.S. into the war.
A controversial claim, but the point is about potentially manipulated intelligence leading to conflict.
Precisely. And it's concerning because, as the sources point out, there have been warnings about Iran being on the verge of a bomb since at least 1995, often from Israeli leaders, and it hasn't happened. So you have to ask, why this narrative now?
And the influence of lobbying and financial interests making it more palatable.
That's the suggestion, that certain narratives gain traction because they serve specific interests.
It's also mentioned that key figures, like the Director of National Intelligence, might be absent from some briefings.
Yeah, another telling detail. It suggests a potentially fractured process. And it highlights how some politicians might privately have doubts, but go along publicly, figuring they can blame others if things go sideways.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from Eastern Europe's grinding conflicts through the Middle East's interconnected flashpoints, right into the heart of U.S. decision-making and these huge, unsettling questions.
It's a lot to take in. But the main point, really, is the absolute need for critical thinking. You have to question the information you're given, ask where it's coming from, especially with so many different agendas at play.
Think about who's really vulnerable in all this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Populations like the Armenians caught in these massive geopolitical games. It's a high-stakes chess match playing out.
So the thought to leave you with, it's a historical echo, really, is a major power like the U.S. truly sovereign, truly independent in its actions?
Or, as these sources provocatively suggest, is it being manipulated by foreign powers and influence? It definitely makes you wonder if we're heading towards some kind of profound internal reckoning.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it helps you keep digging, keep trying to understand the many layers of what's happening in the world. We'll see you next time.